this one for a long time. Really excited to get into it. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 213 of this bad boy, the Mike the Raven podcast. That is, it is the first show of a doubleheader. If you have not checked out the previous episode, that was just last night, and that was volume 27 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite with Ron Caraba, who spent 17 years with the FDNY, staying alive in Engine 225 and in heaven at Ladder 107, as he so humorously told me. Good career with Ron, who finished up as a lieutenant. He's currently active with the FDNY's counseling unit. Great guy to talk to. And we go from that. As you know, we like to mix it up. We're not relegated to one category or the other on this show. And we're going back to the sports aspect of the show with my next guest, who's a man who's been chronicling the happenings of New York City sports for almost 2 decades. A columnist at the New York Post since 2002. He's covered everything from World Series, Super Bowls, NBA Finals, Stanley Cup Finals, and more. An author as well, he's been published 3 times. His books being Emperors and Idiots, the 100-year rivalry between the Yankees and Red Sox from the very beginning to the end of the curse, 1941, the greatest year in sports, and the first fall classic, the Red Sox, the Giants, and the cast of players, pugs, and politicos who reinvented the World Series in 1912. And that, for this episode 213, is a guest I've chased for a while. He's finally here, Mike Vaccaro. Mike, welcome. How are you?
Mike, I'm doing well. How are you doing today? Thanks for having me on.
No, thanks you for being here. I appreciate it very much. So tell me, Mike, first question is always a very easy one. Where'd you grow up?
West Hempstead on Long Island. It was a pretty idyllic upbringing. My parents and me, they moved there about a year and a half before I was born, and that's where we stayed until after I graduated high school. I went to Chaminade on the island in Mineola, and once I went away to school at St. Bonaventure, my parents did as most Long Islanders do and took the Florida Trail down to South Florida to find the sunshine. But I'm a Long Island boy by birth, even though I live in North Jersey now.
Tell me about your early fascination with writing.
Yeah, it's just something that I always loved. I remember, going back to early grammar school. I was always the kid who kind of wrote the letter on behalf of the students to the teacher, to why we should have an extra recess period. And, whenever there was a project, a group project, it was always, even from the very beginning, I can remember for whatever reason they entrusted me with writing it. So I guess maybe that was kind of a sign of things. But I've just always enjoyed reading, and I think reading and writing obviously go hand in hand. If you're going to be a good writer, it's probably helpful to be a prolific reader to be able to get all the things that you need kind of in your toolbox as a writer. So and I always was. I was a prolific reader even very young, and discovered the library pretty early, and I think all of that stuff kind of was aiming toward a career as a writer, even if it was before I even knew it.
Would you say, because there's certain bylines that you see now in given New York newspapers, you're certainly one of them now. I mentioned Mike Lupica off the air. We think of Steve Serby, Neil Best, the list goes on, Joe Sherman. Were there certain sports writers growing up, I imagine a huge sports fan, that you gravitated towards early on, that you really tried to seek out their columns and that ended up influencing your style of writing?
For sure. I grew up in Long Island, so we had Newsday regularly tossed under our porch every day. And so I grew up a huge fan of Steve Jacobson and Joe Gergen. Was fortunate enough to later on become friends and colleagues with both of them. But we just really enjoyed the way that they told stories. And they told them a little bit differently than the New York tabloids did, as I later learned. But certainly, my father would bring home the tabloids, so, I love telling Serby all the time that I grew up reading him. He likes to hear that. I grew up reading Lupica. Lupica was certainly somebody, I think, guys in my generation. I'm 55 years old. He's probably about 10 or 12 years older than us, and he's a guy that a lot of us younger writers who grew up in New York, I think, certainly look to as a way to, a certain way to establish a voice in the community of New Yorkers. But I read everybody. I read Harvey Araton a lot. Yes. I remember reading him all the time. Philip Bondi, I remember reading a lot. Dave Anderson was a guy, once I started reading the Times pretty regularly in high school, really caught my eye, and so did George Vesey, also who was sports at the Times in those days. And Dave Anderson really became a real mentor of mine early in my time in New York, which is a real thrill because, not only was he a terrific reporter and an outstanding writer, but he was a gentleman who really, in a lot of ways behaved the way that I try and behave and the way that I tell a lot of the people who look to me for advice. I tell them they should behave, which is professionally, cordially. There's no reason for silly cheap shots and feuds among media members. Nobody cares about them, for one thing. But I mean, I just think there's a way to conduct yourself. And Dave Anderson was really the model for me from that standpoint.
Talking with Mike Vaccaro here on the Mike the New Haven podcast. It's a pleasure to have Mike aboard here. And if you have a question for him, please fire away, and I'll try to get to it as best I can. So, as sports writers progress, they leave the fandom that they grew up with behind. But one thing that you still have a very strong allegiance to is St. Bonaventure's. You know, and it makes sense. We're always, I feel the same way about my alma mater, Gateway Community College. No matter what happens, you always have a special place in your heart for just that environment and that time in your life. So tell me about going there and how that furthered your love of writing and the business as a whole.
Well, I got really lucky, Mike, because St. Bonaventure really was the perfect environment for me. I mean, it was a smaller school. I'm not so sure that I would have thrived when I was 18 years old at a place like my wife went to LSU, and she had more people probably in her freshman survey class than I did in my freshman class. And it was St. Bonaventure was a place where there was a lot of opportunity because it was a small campus. I was able to really immerse myself in every kind of campus media, not just the newspaper, but also the radio station. I did some TV work there early on. And really, a lot of times your career is a process of elimination. What are you good at? What are you not so good at? And I realized that, I was probably going to be able to make a living in writing. Maybe not so much with my voice, maybe not so much with the way I looked on TV, but it really gave me the opportunity to kind of figure out that that's something that I was, pretty good at and should pursue. When you talk about the fandom, it's funny. You're right. The way you presented it is exactly right. I grew up in New York, grew up on Long Island, so I grew up a Mets fan, grew up a Jets fan, grew up a Knicks fan, an Islanders fan, and I kept those fandoms while I was working out of town. When you move here and those are the teams you cover, they become basically just your, the sources of your material. And I don't root for teams as much as I root for good stories anymore. Good stories and games that end in time for deadline. Those are the two things I root for. And so, it's been a long time since I've lived and died with a team, but I do understand how important it is that you're right, that the people you're writing for, your readers are fans, and this stuff matters to them. There may not be a logical reason to explain why, the Mets losing to the Cubs last night infuriates so many Mets fans, but it's true. It happens. I mean, that's the way sports fans are. And I think it's important for sports columnists especially to remember what it was like to be a fan, even if you're not necessarily a fan of those teams anymore, which I'm not. But the St. Bonaventure fandom that I have for the St. Bonaventure basketball team, it really does kind of allow me to understand what fans go through, because I live and die with the Bonnies every bit as much as they do with the Jets or the Giants or the Knicks or the Nets. And I mean, probably even more so. In fact, my wife has said on more than one occasion, as she's seen me emerge sweaty from watching 2 hours of a Bonaventure game against, Dayton or somebody like that, or, Atlanta tournament game, and I come out looking like I've been playing. And she says, I couldn't put up with this every day. I'm glad you just have this one team. And, I'm glad I have it too, because it does kind of remind me what it is to care so much about a team that you really do live and die with it. You really do stay up nights worrying and wondering about them. And I think it helps me be a better columnist, because you know what? I don't just dismiss the passions and fervent loyalties that fans have for their teams. I mean, it's important. And look, without them, I mean, they really wouldn't be in need for what I do. So I appreciate the fact that fans care so much about sports and care enough about it to where they want to read me talk about a game they probably already watched.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I felt this particularly during the Ranger playoff run. I'm a little older now, and I remember my mom used to tell me all the time when I was younger, they don't pay your bills. What are you getting so amped up about it for?
Right.
And I thought, she's right. And so here I am now at 22. I'm a lot more docile. I'm a lot calmer. But still, I felt that, that little kid in me come out during the Ranger playoff run. You should have seen me during Game 7 against the Penguins in overtime. I couldn't handle it, So it's nice to have that filter, if you will, because the next day I read your column after the Rangers had gone up 2-0 on Tampa, talking about how New York sports is finally emerging from this malaise it had been in. And it was a good column to read, rather if it's a crappy time to be a fan and you want to hear a writer's take on it, or it's a thrilling time, a great victory has just occurred. Same thing. The fans make the paper. They gravitate towards the paper.
What's funny is that a lot of people say, well, you just care about the negative. You want to sell papers. You want clicks. And look, I mean, if you ask me, do I want you to buy the paper, or do I want you to click on my story? Of course I do. So, I mean, to me, if you're going to accuse me of clickbait, I'm going to say thank you, of course, and that's how I make my living. But to me, what people forget is that, look, I mean, yeah, sure, there are some negative stories that sell papers and move traffic online, but we're never better in our business than when times are well. When the Mets were in the World Series in 2015, you couldn't find a New York Post in a newsstand in New York because they were already sold out. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, that's what happens when times are good. You know, that's the fun time because people can't get enough of the teams. They want to read more and more and more. They don't want to be hit on the head day after day, year after year. Your team stinks. Your team stinks. Your team stinks. This team stinks too. The entire city of New York stinks. And that's so much of what we've done the last couple of years. So yes, it's refreshing when one of these teams, shows you that they're not just going to try your patience as a fan. Look, I mean, whenever I hear from a Jets fan, who talks about, I've been a fan since 19 Buppity Book, and I'm like, God bless. And I said, I really do hope one of these days your patience and your loyalty will be rewarded, because it really should be, because you deserve that, because fans deserve for good things to happen to them in ways that I don't think people appreciate that we understand in the media. So to me, I mean, without rooting for the teams to do well, I mean, I said before, I root for good stories. The good story is when the team is winning. Look, I mean, I've written plenty of columns I like out of losing locker rooms and losing clubhouses, but it's better when the team wins. It's better. It's better to talk about the champagne blinding the players' eyes, when they won the pennant, as opposed to sitting around their locker, moping after going 3-12 in a football season. It's just better. It's better to write about. It's better to read about, and it makes our lives better too. Our lives better too.
Yeah, and we'll talk about it later on, but think about the spring of 1994 with the Rangers and the Knicks. Think about that Yankees dynasty of the late 1990s.
Oh yeah.
Think of even the Mets in their runs in 1999 and 2000. That must have been a heck of a time to be a writer.
It was. I mean, look. I mean, there was no greater time. And then there was a stretch in 1999, 2000, where the Knicks went to the finals.
Right.
And the Mets and the Yankees both went to the playoffs. The Yankees won the World Series. Then the Giants went to the Super Bowl. And then the Mets and the Yankees are playing the Subway Series. And for me, that comes on the heels of covering my first Olympics in Sydney, where there was a billion great stories. You couldn't keep up with all the great stories. And if we were right back from Sydney into the baseball playoffs, which culminated in the Subway Series, and then the Devils won the Stanley Cup, and the Devils then went to the finals of the Stanley Cup. That was the Star Ledger then, so that was a big story for me. So that was glorious. I mean, I knew that every word I wrote was being digested and devoured by a hungry readership. That's the good time. When both your football teams stink and the baseball teams can't get out of their own way, people will read that because they kind of want to know why you think that's happening, but nobody wants to read that. Nobody wants to write it.
Right.
I'd far prefer to write about the good than the bad. That's just a fact of life. People don't want to believe that. They can believe whatever they want to believe, but I'm telling you that it's better. The times are better when the times are good. Look at 94, there was that stretch where the Rangers and the Knicks had a playoff game every other day, and it was glorious. And, oh, by the way, the Yankees were in first place, although that was kind of a star-crossed season, of course, because it wound up with a strike amputating the season in August. But that was a wonderful time. I mean, at the time, just the entire playoffs, the NHL and NBA playoffs, where every other day you're writing about the Knicks and the Rangers, and the Devils and the Mets were in the playoffs that year too, so they were involved, and it was great. I mean, there's no greater profession than when you're in the media and your teams that you cover are doing well. There's just no better time, no better job.
I would say, and people still have the newspapers. I'll tell you, from the Giants' second Super Bowl run when they knocked off New England the second time, and when the Yankees won the World Series in 2009, I still have the Sports Illustrated copies. I still have the papers from that time. So to your point, it always is going to resonate with the fans, especially during the good times as opposed to the lean ones. And to get back to your career now, you first started out in the Olean Times-Herald. Now, for those that may not know where Olean is, tell me where it is and tell me what the sports climate was there.
Yeah, so Olean is where St. Bonaventure is located, essentially. Okay. St. Bonaventure is its own little small town, but Olean is the big city, if you will. Some big, not that big, trust me. That's kind of when you talk about town and gown, they're the town, Bonaventure's the gown. And so I actually interned there as a junior in college. The summer of my junior year, I mean, I struck out on a million internships. I was reaching for the stars, and I just kept getting one rejection after another from places I applied, like Newsday and the Times and the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, on and on. Couldn't get a sniff anywhere. I thought I was going to, not have an internship that summer, which would have been devastating. And kind of stepped in a wonderful pothole when Olean the editor of the Olean paper, was friends with a professor of mine in college, and he called and offered me a job there. $5 an hour, just go out and write a story every day. Find a story every day. Basically, I was writing a column when I was 21 years old every day. It was a general interest column. It wasn't a column per se because it didn't have my picture in the paper, but it was basically go out and find a story, any beat, sports, music, anybody in the community. Go out and find me an interesting story every day, 5 days a week. And it taught me a discipline of writing every day that was just imperative to being a successful newspaper writer. But it was the greatest internship anybody ever had. And I realized that, I was lucky to get it. Certainly, if the opportunity was there to go to the Washington Post, after my first day in Olean, I would have done it just because that's what you do. But I wouldn't have had a better experience. And so as a result of that experience with Olean, they offered me a job. And originally, it wasn't in sports. I mean, again, I went through the process of applying for jobs and all through the final couple of months of my college career, and just it was a bad time. The economy wasn't good. Newspapers were first starting to kind of feel the effects of what's become a full-blown panic all these years later. They weren't hiring me anyway. And so I used to wallpaper my walls with all kinds of rejection letters. I believe the total at the end was 117, which made for a crowded couple of walls in my bedroom. But yeah, I got that job. It was to cover cops and courts, and I did that for about a month. And it was different, and it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. And I was already wondering, well, how am I going to ever get into sports writing? And just, it's amazing when you put yourself in a position. I mean, the fact that I was working at the paper for a month, one of the sports writers decided, he was done being a sports writer. And so he went to the sports editor and said, I'd like to transfer into news. Can somebody take my place? And, I'd done plenty of work for the sports editor before, so he kind of was familiar with me. He called me into his office and said, how would you like to be a sports writer? And I said, yes, please. And that's really how it started. I mean, we all get in this business, Mike, thinking we're just going to outwork the guys, our competitors, and our work ethic and our talent is going to carry us, and that'll be all we rely on. Doesn't take long to realize that you need good luck, good fortune, maybe good timing. Those all play a part too. Now, also the hard work and the talent helps allow you to be successful once you get those opportunities. But being able to get those opportunities sometimes just requires being in the right place at the right time. You learn that early in this business, and I've learned it a lot. It's happened to me a lot. And so within a month of going to the paper, not only was I a sports writer, but I was covering St. Bonaventure basketball, which is the most important beat on the whole paper, just because of what that sport means to the newspaper. And they were actually going through a pretty down time. I covered a couple of terrible teams, unfortunately. But you know what? The readership was amazing, and the following was great, and I learned on the fly what it is to cover a team that people care about. And it was only a 25,000 circulation newspaper, but it seemed like I had about 1 million readers because my phone never stopped ringing, and the feedback was incredible, and just a great experience. I was really lucky to kind of right away at age 22, age 23 to be covering a Division I basketball team, and that really kind of got my feet wet in a hurry.
And everybody finds their niche in the business. You found yours with sports, and you mentioned cops and courts, for example. He's since passed away. He was a friend of mine. You remember Lenny Levitt from Newsday? He found his niche with the police beat that ended up being his beat forever, and he loved it. So when you have a passion and you're able to at least parlay that passion into finding your own space in a very wide-ranging business where it's easy to get lost in the shuffle, that's a great thing. Everything else that comes after that is gravy.
It really is. It's a great point. And look, that's part of it. What separates those who, I started this business with an incredible array of talented people that I knew very well, people I got in school with, people I just met along the way, and a lot of those folks, are doing other things now. They just, for one reason or another, they didn't get the job they wanted. Their career wasn't going as fast as they wanted. They were kind of they realized it wasn't for them. And a lot of those people, because they're successful and smart enough to understand that about themselves, they looked elsewhere. They became lawyers, they became businessmen, they became stockbrokers, they became money managers. One became a doctor, and good for them. Some of the, I do think that one of the reasons that I've been able to succeed, however you want to describe what my personality is, I think it's ideally suited to newspapers specifically, but to media in general. I'm while I'm generally shy in social settings, I'm not professionally. It's a very strange kind of, kind of duality that I have. I mean, when it comes to anything related to work, this goes back to when I was 19 years old and just starting out. I had no problem introducing myself to the local sports editor. I had no problem, trying to get on, trying to do a beat as a sophomore that most people didn't do until junior year, stuff like that. I was very aggressive. That's not, if you met me and we talked about, the world, you wouldn't necessarily think that about me. But when we start talking about the business, then I become just highly inquisitive and highly aggressive and highly, I'm just, it's hard to explain why, that's just the way I was wired, I guess. And thankfully, because look, I mean, I'm not the kind of person who in my private life is just going to call up a stranger to talk to them. That's why I've been a lousy salesman, I think. But personally, I've had no problems calling up people that I've ripped in paper the day before. It's, and basically, inviting them to rip me back if they want to, or, even when I was covering courts and cops for that short time, I mean, anybody who does that beat knows sometimes you have to go to the house of a kid who was killed in a DUI accident the night before and ask his mother for a picture. I mean, there's no harder chore than that. And yet, while I didn't enjoy doing that, it was just something that I realized I had to do, and so it didn't bother me to do it, as it might. I wouldn't do that. In my personal life, going to my neighbor's house and asking for a picture of their dead son after an accident. But professionally, it's something I can do. So,
right.
I think a lot of us find that as we develop our professional lives, there are things that we just are good at, things we just are comfortable doing, and that allows you to be successful every bit as much as the willingness to work hard, as whatever talent God gave you, that kind of stuff. All that stuff plays in terms of making you successful.
It's kind of like the old Faith No More song, "We care a lot, it's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it."
That's exactly right. That's a great point, 100%.
Talking with Mike Vaccaro here in the Mike the New Haven podcast. Certainly happy to have him. So, you spent some time at the Northwest Arkansas Times. Sorry about that, as well as the Kansas City. Yeah, it is, as well as the Kansas City Star. And what's interesting is Kansas City, yes, the Royals, of course, and the Chiefs as well, and also Kansas basketball. But you were talking also with the Northwest Arkansas Times. They love their Razorbacks. And you go to certain parts of the country, and the love of sports is different. If they don't have a professional team, they certainly delve heavily into the college scene. So tell me about working in Razorback country first.
Yeah, it was a great experience. Even though it ended badly for me there, I wound up fired when I was 25 and thought my career was over. That's a whole other podcast. The saga of how I got fired. But it was 2 years, and it was maybe the two most valuable years of my development in this business. For one thing, got totally out of my comfort zone. I mean, a kid who grew up in the Northeast, basically never left New York, and now I'm traveling to Fayetteville, Arkansas, to live and to work, and it was a complete culture shock. Look, I mean, it's it's different down there. It just is. It's a different culture, different lifestyle, different pace. People talk a lot slower, or I talk a lot faster, depending on who you ask. It's very different, but then of course you get to the specifics of the sports. And yes, I mean, look, I mean, we cared about two things at that paper: the high school sports, maybe some American Legion baseball during the summertime, and the Razorbacks, football, basketball, baseball. Those were our pro teams, and I've never experienced a more passionate, a more intense fan base than Razorback fans. And look, I mean, we were in a unique position in Fayetteville because we were not only home to a lot of just Arkansas fans, the entire state, obviously, are Razorback fans, but that's where the university is located, is Fayetteville, which is where our paper was located. So all the people who work there and all the students live there, and it's just all the athletes read the paper. It was very much, it had very much of a vibe of a Metro newspaper, even though the paper itself was barely 20,000 circulation. And there was no internet then, so 20,000 was 20,000. So, I mean, it was hyper intense. And I learned that lesson right away. And you know what? I mean, I was smart enough to realize that, I think I could have gone one of two ways there. I could have played the New York wise guy and tried to get people to hate me right away, which would have caused a lot of, a lot of riff, a lot of back and forth. You know what? Maybe I would have been better off that way. Maybe I would have got a radio gig for a minute out of it. Would become a TV guy, would have become known, as that guy down there.
As the heel, right? To use a wrestling term.
Exactly right. As the heel. That's exactly right. if you could do that well, I guess perhaps that would have been a smarter play. But you know what? That's not who I am, and that's not how I do the job. It's never how I want to do the job. I didn't pretend when I showed up there that, hey, I'm one of you guys. I've been a Razorback fan my whole life. But I think, look, I mean, I was lucky. I mean, I think my leadership was patient enough for me to realize that, all right, this guy isn't from here, but let's give him a chance. And, I did the job the way I do the job now. I mean, I didn't quite have the wisdom or the knowledge when I was 23 as a 24 as I do now at 55. But I did the job honestly. I was a reporter. I made sure that what I wrote was based in knowledge and reporting. And I didn't take cheap shots, and I didn't go for the cheap laugh. Which is easy to do when you're a Yankee in the South. It just is. But I tried to avoid that. That's not to say I wouldn't bust chops with my friends or with readers, and sometimes I would have fun with columns. But I'd always poke fun at myself every bit as much as I would poke fun at the environment around me. And so I had a really happy experience writing in that circumstance. I mean, really, I immersed myself in Razorback history and Razorback lore. So I was able to become kind of knowledgeable right away about the lore of Razorback football and basketball specifically. I got very close very early with Nolan Richardson, which was a smart move. Later on, he and I had a falling out, which was kind of a bad move on my part, but that's the way these relationships work sometimes. But it was a glorious time. I mean, honestly, one of the great moments of my life professionally happened there. And I'll try and tell the story quickly, but in my second year there, they lost on opening day of football season to the Citadel, which was a calamity. I mean, it was their first year in the SEC, and the Citadel walked in and just stomped them. And the score was, the Citadel runs the ball like Army, so it was like the game was over in like an hour and a half. I think the final score was like 13-7, so it wasn't a stomping, but trust me, it was a stomping. It was humiliation. And so we didn't have a we didn't have a Monday paper because it was Labor Day. And so on Sunday, the day after the game, we were off. We had nothing to do. We had a paper to put out. I remember I was out to dinner with my girlfriend, and suddenly I was the owner of the restaurant came over and recognized me from the paper and said, "Wow, it's pretty amazing about Coach Crow, huh?" And I said, "What happened to Coach Crow?" And it turns out Coach Crow, the head coach, Jack Crow, had been fired. And I'm like, "Holy cow, what a great story!" And then I'm all fired up, and then I realized, "Oh my God, we don't have a newspaper tomorrow." And so you can call it what you want, call it just the naivete of being young or just whatever. But I immediately knew that my date was over. And it's funny because we broke up a couple of days after that. But I drove her home, and the whole time I'm thinking, we got to do something. And I called my editor, there was a press conference at like 3:30, and I got to the facility at 3 o'clock and got my editor on the phone. She was home, and she was about 4 glasses into a bottle of wine. And I said, "Janet, we got to come out with a paper tomorrow." And she said, she was like, "What are you talking about? You're a lunatic. We don't have a paper tomorrow." I said, "You don't understand. The coach of the Razorbacks was fired. That's the biggest story in the state. We have to do something." This is, again, 10 years later, there's an internet, so you can do all your work online, not worry about the print product. But that's all we had. We had the print product. And we were not coming out that day. It was awful. And I'm screaming at her, "There's got to be something we can do. There's got to be something we can do." And, of course, I'm saying this realized logically that there's nothing we can do. You can't just put out a newspaper. The son of a gun, if, we go through, all of our reporters are there, we cover the event like we're going to do something, realizing, unfortunately, we're going to have to hold it 2 days. When all of a sudden I got this emergency, at the end of the press conference, an emergency message, "Call your boss immediately." Somehow the editor had convinced the publisher to come out with a 6-page extra. No ads, no nothing. We had, but the contingent was contingent upon me calling the production people, the circulation people, the makeup people, and all, asking them very nicely if they would mind coming in on a day off to work for free. And if you can believe it, I still had a little bit of New York charm in me, and I was able to go 3 for 3 in agreement. All those people came in. And then, as a bonus, I got the advertising manager to actually sell the edition. So it actually, we were going to do it and take it as a sunk cost. We're actually able to actually make money off it. And it was basically a one-shot deal. We got done at 3 o'clock in the morning. There was only a limited amount of circulation people that could call in because those people all had different jobs. So basically, we had 5,000 issues of the newspaper, and 10 of us basically went and started throwing it on, into people's yards all around Fayetteville. Now, I'm never going to have a day like that again the rest of my life. I haven't had a day since then like that. It was amazing, but it was the kind of thing that we were able to do at a small paper in a small town where the interest in the football program is so hyper intense that we realized after a while that as crazy as it was to come up with an extra edition when there was going to be no paper, we did it anyway. And it remains one of the greatest experiences of my life.
I think that's the highlight of the show. Usually I put out highlight clips the next day. That's the story that's going to be the highlight.
I mean, literally, I was out there extra, throwing the paper, just like the paper boys in the movies. It was awesome.
I mean, and again, that is, they talk about living and dying with their teams. That is the team in that state because I'm sure they have outside interest, but that's who they live in.
Arkansas State, but nobody really cares about Arkansas State unless you live in Jonesboro. And, like I said, people care about their local high schools, but the Razorbacks are, not just sport, they're religion.
Right.
And, it was actually very, very educational for me. Look, I grew up in New York, and there's split loyalties in every sport, right? There's multiple teams in every sport. Not everybody in New York is a Yankees fan. Maybe the most popular team, the Giants, but there are Mets fans and Jets fans too. In Arkansas, there is no plan B. You root for the Razorback. It's kind of like part of the vows you take if you're going to live there.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I feel it because I'm in Connecticut, right? I grew up a Yankees, Knicks, Giants, and Rangers fan. I still am. But my next door neighbor could be a Red Sox fan and a Patriots fan. It's so split. I generally say as a rule of thumb, because I'm in New Haven, you head towards Stamford, it's generally the New York teams. You'll find fans of the New York teams. You head towards Hartford, it's generally the Massachusetts teams because that's closer to Massachusetts, especially since we lost the Whalers in 1997. Sure. And even then, guys would tell me when they used to go to Whalers games, they would be sold out only when the Rangers and the Bruins would come to town because most of the people in our state root for the Bruins, root for the Rangers.
Right. Well, and the thing from my time in Arkansas, I mean, it was really a remarkable time. Because not only learning about the Razorbacks, and I actually met my wife there. I met her a couple of days after that girl I told you about broke up with me. So go figure it. That things work out. But I mean, the other thing, I got there in July of 1992. Well, guess what? Like literally 3 days after I arrived there, a former professor at the University of Arkansas announced his candidacy for president of the United States, Bill Clinton. So I was in Arkansas for the entirety of Bill Clinton's presidential campaign. And I'm not, look, we can talk about that on a whole different podcast. But I mean, it was obviously an exciting time to have somebody who actually had lived in a house 3 blocks away from where my apartment was running for president. I mean, you talk about a heady time, and so you have that also on top of everything else. In terms of my job and my life. I mean, it was just being a New Yorker living in the Deep South. It was a very interesting time. And, I'll never have a time quite like that. I'm not sure I necessarily want a time quite like that, but it was great to be one of those things where it's great to be able to say, yeah, I lived that life.
It reminds me, every time I hear that name, I think of what Don Imus used to call him. I grew up a huge Imus fan, called him Bubba. Simply called him Bubba all the time. Either that or Tricky Dick, he used to call Clinton. I miss Don. So just a quick note on the Kansas City Star, your time there before we get to your time at the Star Ledger, and of course, currently with the Post. That, you go to Kansas City, and this is during a very lean time for the Royals. The Chiefs had some good teams. Joe Montana had taken them to an AFC Championship game, and if not for his concussion, probably could have taken them to the Super Bowl. But the Royals, George Brett was at the end. They did have young guys there. Johnny Damon was just starting up. Carlos Beltran was just starting up. Tell me, is it more of a Chiefs town or is it more of a Royals town, at least back then?
It depends on who's doing well. And it's really weird. The same way that like a lot of our teams are never good together. I mean, the Mets and the Yankees never seem to be good together. I mean, they are this year, but the Giants and the Jets are never good together. I mean, for so many years, and it's still the case. The Chiefs and the Royals have never been good together. When the Royals had their great teams in the 70s, the Chiefs were abysmal. And then the Chiefs had their rise in the 90s, and when I was there in the late 90s, the Royals, it was the most impressive place in the world was to go to a Royals game because they were horrible. And then the Chiefs, spluttered and kind of ran off the cliff, and they were 2-14 a couple of years, and that's when the Royals started to rise and became world champions. And then the Royals, lose all their good players as small market teams do, and here comes Patrick Mahomes. It's very odd. I mean, it's almost like they just never can get it together. Now I was there, but I was only there for a year. The year I was there, the Royals finished in 4th place, and the Chiefs were 13-3, and #1 seed in the AFC. That was Elvis Gerbach's first year, although he missed a bunch of time. So Gannon was Rich Gannon was the quarterback. And that was the year they lost to the Broncos in the first year of the playoffs, and the Broncos went on to win the Super Bowl that year. And that was very similar to Arkansas, only multiply it by however exponentially you want to multiply it, because Kansas City is that much bigger a town than Fayetteville is. And I mean, the Chiefs were it. I mean, the Chiefs were everything. Every game was sold out. I mean, every Chiefs event was the event. And it was amazing. I mean, it was. I mean, it was. They lost that game, and you could literally feel the town's depression for 2 weeks. I mean, nobody wanted to work. Nobody wanted. Waiters would come over to you in a restaurant and say, "Yeah, what do you want?" You go to a bar and let's say, "Hello, can I get a beer here?" And they say, "Yeah, what do you want?" I mean, the entire town was just in an utter abject depression. But it's funny. I mean, a lot of the best stories I had that year weren't with the Chiefs, because when a team is that good. I mean, now look, there aren't other papers in Kansas City, but there's plenty of radio stations, plenty of TV. Topeka, Wichita, they all show up for Kansas City when they're good. So a lot of the better stories came with the Royals. And it's funny, I remember, Johnny Damon was a second or third year player, and the Royals came up with this cockamamie scheme, and certainly cockamamie in retrospect, where they would pay for a player's house, with the idea that would make them put them in a good mood to want to re-sign with them when the time came, which is hilarious, because in Kansas City you can buy something close to a mansion for about $300,000. By the time a player like Johnny Damon is a free agent, he's going to command a contract for, in those years, $50 million. So it was never a very well guided plan. But you know what? Johnny Damon agreed to have his house paid for, and I remember standing in his house with him and his first wife. And it was very cool. That's the kind of story you could do, not only because the times were different, but because the city was different. I mean, I'm not sure you could ever have done that in New York with a player, go to his house as it was being built. But you couldn't in Kansas City. I mean, those are the kind of stories you could get. And those are the kind of stories we did, and those are the kind of stories I really enjoyed doing. I mean, I spent Elvis Gerbach's first game in Kansas City hanging out with his parents, who were off-the-boat Croatians. And it was a hilarious story, and it was a fun story. And I want to bring a sad story because he wound up separating his shoulder that day. And so, it was get the gamut, in a 100-inch story, you get the gamut of every human emotion you can. And that's the kind of story that you're able to do in Kansas City a lot easier than you can in New York. I'd love to keep doing those stories in New York. It's just harder just because it's New York. But yeah, I mean, but you're right about the disparity between the Chiefs and the Royals. It was easy to declare in 1998 that this is a Chiefs town, but I was also there in 2014, 2015 when the Royals, made their run and then ultimately won the World Series. And that you couldn't. It wasn't a red town then; it was a blue town, very much of a blue town. And I believe they actually got more people to the baseball championship parade than they did for the Chiefs parade, which is amazing, because I did think I would have guessed that, all things being equal, if it was one or the other, I would have guessed the Chiefs. But the proof is in the pudding.
And before I get to the New York Star Ledger, Derek Thomas was on the Chiefs during that time, and he sadly got killed in a car accident in 2000. Hall of Fame linebacker. Did you have any notable interactions covering him?
I did, and for the reason that he and I have the exact same birthday. We were both born on January 1st, 1967. And he wasn't an easy guy to really. He wasn't an easy nut to crack. He just was very, difficult, and he didn't necessarily trust reporters. Not the first guy to run into it. That, and I don't even remember the context anymore. But for whatever reason, he and I were shooting the breeze one day, and I mentioned that he and I shared the same birthday. He's like, "Get out of here." He's like, "I don't believe you." So I had to show my wallet. When I showed him my wallet, my driver's license, January 1st, 1967. From that moment on, he and I were. I mean, if there was a story, he was going to give it to me, because he called me twin. I mean, as you can kind of plainly see, he and I look nothing like each other.
Right.
But he called me twin, and we got along great. And it really, really, really affected me deeply when we got into that accident, and subsequently when he passed. It was a bad time for me, because you don't really get to know a lot of guys in this business, and he was one guy that actually allowed me in. And he was just a little bit past his peak. He was still very, very good, still an All-Pro. But the previous 3 or 4 years, he'd been borderline LT. He wasn't quite that anymore. still very good. And I think part of the reason why we were able to bond is like he was willing to talk to me about the frustrations of knowing what it's like to be great and not being that great anymore. I remember doing a column about that with him at one point. But yeah, that was PT was he was okay by me, and he and I had a good relationship. It was great. I still miss him. I still can't believe he's gone. I really can't. We try to honor our birthday for two of us now.
And he's been gone now 22 years. He died actually
Yeah.
February 8th, 2000. That's exactly 2 weeks before I was born.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. Yeah.
Right, 2 weeks before I was born. So, that brings us, of course, into your time with the Star Ledger, and you picked a heck of a time to go there because it's not just the New York teams. It's also New Jersey. You mentioned the Devils. Scott Stevens is there. Scott Niedermayer's there. Martin Brodeur, Ken Danico. Patrick Elias is just starting up. You have the Yankee dynasty. The Mets have just gotten Piazza. And even though the Rangers, after stupidly letting Mark Messier walk out the door, they still have Wayne Gretzky. They still have Brian Leetch and Mike Richter and Adam Graves. So, especially with the Yankees, I mean, that as a writer, we talked about it earlier, and the Knicks are still good too. That's Camelot. Because when did you get there? For that 1998 season?
So I got there in July of '98. I guess my first day was August 1st, '98. And so and I arrived as a baseball columnist. I wasn't hired as a general interest columnist. I was hired as a baseball columnist. And what a time to be a baseball columnist. I mean, you had the Yankees who were going to win 125 games that year. The Mets had just acquired Mike Piazza, so they kind of shaken off a couple of years of just being, pretty irrelevant. And they wound up going to the final week of the season that year. And oh, by the way, I spent the last 2 weeks of September, the last weeks of the season, bouncing back and forth between Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire, who were both pursuing, and then Roger Maris, then kind of fending off each other. And look, I guess that whole storyline comes in asterisk now, quite appropriately, given what we know about what they did to get there. But the moment we didn't know that, it was a heady time. It was an unbelievably flush time at the Newark Star Ledger. I mean, we literally couldn't spend enough money. I remember calling my sports editor one time. He wanted me to get to Milwaukee to pick up the McGuire chase, and I called the company travel agent, and they just regrettably informed me, you can't get a plane ticket there for under $2,000. And I said, well, okay. So I called sports editor. He was like annoyed when I called him. He's like, what's the problem? And I said, I don't think I can get to Milwaukee. He's like, what do you mean you can't get to Milwaukee? What do you want the story? I said, no, but the plane ticket costs $2,000. And he said, so pay it. And I mean, we don't get a lot of those conversations anymore with the people who are responsible for the money, but it was a very flush time. We traveled wherever we wanted, to any store we wanted to. I mean, it was just remarkable. Now I wound up spending my first couple of years at the Ledger, probably been close to 150 days a year on the road between all the teams and all the teams were good then. The Knicks were good, the Devils were good, Rangers were good, Mets and Yankees were good, Giants were good, Jets were good, and they were all good. Yeah. So we would go everywhere. It was glorious. And I think that operation, which is now advanced media, NJ.com, they're more focused on the Jersey teams. But I don't even mention Rutgers was really starting to try and put the pieces in place to where they become more than a sleeping giant of a football program. Hopefully, they became a Big Ten team. And Seton Hall had some terrific teams. They covered some incredible Seton Hall games under Tommy Amaker. It was an incredible time to be a columnist there, and we approached things in those years at the Ledger the way that they do at the New York papers. I mean, every game mattered, every team mattered. Wherever the story was, that's where you're going to go. And if it cost $2,000 to go there, that was the cost of doing business. It was terrific. It really was.
Because think about it. I don't think from the moment you got there in August of 1998 to 2002, to June of 2002, you had time to take a breath. Because let's recap it. That's fall of '98. The Yankees have that incredible season. They win the World Series. They sweep San Diego. Knicks are in the finals a few months later in the spring of '99, June of '99. Then a few months later, you have the Mets and the Yankees in their playoff runs. They both go to the LCS. The Yankees end up winning the World Series. Yankees win again in 2000. Knicks make a conference finals run. Devils win the Stanley Cup, as you were telling me off the air. Subway Series in 2000. Devils go back to the Cup final, come one game short against the Avalanche in 01. Ray Bourque finally gets his cup, and to round it all out, New Jersey, the Nets, after being irrelevant for years,
Right.
trade for Jason Kidd, and boom, they're in the NBA Finals.
And maybe the most fun time of my time in Newark, it was hilarious, was probably the first month or two of the Nets when they acquired Kidd. Now remember, that was right after 9/11, so everybody's kind of just perspectives was recalibrated. Mm-hmm. Lou Lamoriello had actually taken over the Nets in addition to the Devils, and Lamoriello is one of my favorite guys I've ever dealt with in the business. He's tremendous, and I love what he did. The Nets always padded their attendance figures. Right. He took over and said that's not going to happen anymore. So for the first 2 months of Jason Kidd era, there were 4,000, 5,000 people at the Meadowlands. Nobody, because the Nets had been terrible for so long. Nobody was much in the mood to go to sporting events after 9/11. And Lou wasn't padding the stat, wasn't padding the attendance numbers. So you went to those games, you were there with friends and family. Let me tell you something, Mike. Those teams, especially when Kidd first arrived, was the most fun I've seen pro basketball in this market, even including those Knicks teams that went to the finals. Because even those Knicks teams that went to the finals, they were good, but they were rugged. They played a different kind of basketball. All of a sudden, Kidd shows up, and he's got Kenny Martin on one wing, and Kerry Kittles on the other, and Keith Van Horn, and they're going up and down the floor, and it's just spectacular. And not only is it fun to watch, but they're winning. And nobody knows about it because nobody's going to the games. Nobody's watching the games. So I felt for 2 months I had this story to myself. It was funny because one of my dearest friends in life is Adrian Wojnarowski, from the king of the Woj bomb. He was the columnist at Bergen then, and he and I would go to these games together, and we were the only ones who seemed to care. And we were just falling over each other, trying to outright each other, for these games nobody was going to. And of course, after a while, people started to pay attention, and they went to the finals that year. So then they weren't an open secret anymore. But there was no more fun than those first couple of months. The Kidd was teaching the Nets how to win, and just teaching everybody else just what fun, up and down basketball can look like. And it was great. I've always said if that team played at the Garden, they'd be as beloved as the 70 Knicks team, even if they never won a championship, because they were that much fun to watch.
And even in 2003, you kind of had a quasi version of the 1994 spring with the Rangers and the Knicks, with the Devils and the Nets, because they both went to the finals. The Devils, it played out exactly as 94. The Spurs ultimately were the better team that year and got the better of New Jersey, but the hockey team won. The Devils ended up beating Paul Kariya and the Ducks in 7, and Scott Stevens lifted the cup for a third time.
It was great. It really was. Those Devils teams, man, I'll tell you what, they were fun to cover. I had never really covered hockey before. I mean, I grew up on Long Island, so I grew up a big Islanders fan. So it wasn't like it wasn't like I didn't know anything about hockey. But covering hockey is a different animal than the other sports. It's just different. And covering the two, I didn't cover much of the 2003 teams because I was the post by then. But it was back to back the teams in '99 and 2000. 2000, 2001, I should say. Those were fun teams, and they were great guys to cover. I mean, Claude Lemieux, I couldn't get enough writing about him. I couldn't get enough writing about Scott Stevens. I mean, couldn't get enough writing about Larry Robinson. I mean, Larry Robinson had this incredible post-game tirade when it looked like their season was over in 2000. They go down 3 games to 1 to the Flyers, come back to win that series and win the cup. I mean, just every day was an incredible. And actually, one of my favorite stories is, I was wandering around the practice dressing room early in their playoff run in '99, and I guess I must have this look on my face, and I just showed up, and this punk kid shows up and says, "Hey, you have no idea what you're doing, do you?" And I didn't know what it was, and I realized it was John Madden, who was a rookie for the Devils that year, and he said, "You don't know what you're going to write today, do you?" I'm like, "No, I'm a little stuck." He's like, "Write about that guy." And he points at Jay Pandolfo. And then he gives me a couple of things about why Jay Pandolfo was interesting, and he was right. So I went over and talked to Jay Pandolfo and had a great column the next day. And showed up the next day, and I told Matt, I said, "Hey, you could be an assignment editor if this hockey thing doesn't work out. Thank you." And he said, "You know what? Don't do it every day, but once in a while, if you need a column, come see me." And later on in that playoff series, I'm going to forget the details, but he pulled me over and he said, "It's time for you to talk to Pepe." Pepe was Claude Lemieux. And they were just incredible. And I'm going to forget the details, like I said, because they kind of blur together. I'll just never forget that. I'm like, man, thank you. And then there's a postscript of that because, so of course, just the way things are, hockey becomes kind of a secondary back burner sport into the playoffs. So the next year, they're defending Cup champions. I don't really cover them much until February. They're playing the Rangers, and I decided I'm going to go and check in with the Devils. So I do, and I show up and I talk to Marty, and Bordeaux is a great subject, of course. Not very often you get a chance to cover one of the greatest guys who ever do what they do for a living. So that was always a thrill. But I'm one in the locker room, and all of a sudden somebody grabs me by the shoulder, and I turn around and he's mad, and I thought he was going to give me a hug, and instead he just starts berating me. He starts literally cursing me for like 3 minutes straight. You so-and-so, what are you doing here? You so-and-so, you don't belong here. You blah, 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 blah. With a strong line of beeps, screaming at me. And then he just turns heels and goes to the shower. And look, I've had athletes, rip me in clubhouses a lot of times before. So it wasn't that bothered me, but I didn't think I had done anything to offend this poor guy. And so I waited around until after he got out of the shower and went back up to him in his locker. And I said, hey, Mad Dog, we got a problem? He's like, no, I was just messing with you. How you doing? Where you been? So it was just, it was like Joe Pesci. He was messing, Joe Pesci messing with Henry Hill. That's what he was doing. And so I guess I had done a pretty good job because he felt comfortable around me enough to curse a blue streak around me, but only in good fun.
Interesting guy.
That was a unique moment for sure.
And one of the better defensive forwards of his era. And
absolutely, and
very good player.
And wound up winning another cup with the Blackhawks later on. So
yep.
For a guy who himself, he would describe himself having a thimble full of talent, but he sure maximized that, and made a pretty good living for himself in the NHL too.
I would say Mike Vaccaro is our guest here on the Mike and Maven podcast, longtime writer for the New York Post. We'll hit on a couple of more things because 01, 02, there's sports after 9/11. In 8 days, it'll be the anniversary of Piazza's home run. And then, the Yankee run afterwards, all the way to Game 7 of the World Series. We talk about that Nets final. In the middle of that, you make a career move to go to the Post. So first, in covering, and we just passed the anniversary, covering sports after that day and seeing how it helped people, it distracted them for just a little while from what was going on. Tell me about your personal experience living in the tri-state at the time.
Well, the moment the towers went down, your instinct is all of a sudden I'm a news reporter. I'm not a sports writer anymore. I wanted to get down to ground zero, and I called the newsroom and told them I wanted to get down there, and they said, well, there's no way you're going to get in. And if you don't, as a sports writer, I had plenty of credentials, but they were all to get into Madison Square Garden, Yankee Stadium. There weren't like any, I didn't have any police credentials or anything like that. So they said this could be wasting your time and our time. They said, this was on the day of 9/11. They said, why don't you go someplace in Jersey and watch the sunrise over New York? That's what I did. I went, got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, went down to Hoboken and watched the sunrise over the Twin Towers, which was just a powerful image. Talked to some people, wrote a column for the news side, and got a lot of response. And in fact, every year on Facebook now, I make sure to repost that column. You can't even find it on the internet anymore. It's interesting. It just kind of vanished. So I retyped it a couple of years ago, and I reposted it on Facebook, and it's remarkable every year how many people respond to it. But you know what? I also knew I wasn't one of these total reactionaries that, well, sports is never going to matter to us ever again. Well, no. I was also a guy, and I ultimately wrote a book about this very subject that was inspired in part by a conversation I had with Phil Rizzuto at the World Series that year in an elevator. And he talked about how, the previous months, it reminded him of his rookie year of 1941 when, the whole world was going to hell. And, people got by reading the sports page. They didn't have to worry about what was going on in Nazi Germany for the 15 minutes they were reading the sports page. They didn't have to worry about what was happening in Japan as long as they were reading the sports page. They didn't have to worry about if their brothers or their sons were going to get drafted because they read the sports page. And that's really, they didn't not necessarily just read the sports page, but they were able to imbibe themselves in sports and DiMaggio streak and Ted Williams and whirl away in a big fight. And that's kind of what it was like in 2001. There was a respectful period, obviously, of waiting, but when sports came back, people were ready for them to come back as something to just take their minds off the fact there was still this horrible cloud in lower Manhattan, and part of that happened even before the games returned, when so many of the athletes visited the firehouses, visited the police precincts, and really became citizens of the city in ways that a lot of New York athletes specifically don't really want to become citizens of Manhattan or of the city or the boroughs. But then, of course, when the games returned, that Piazza night was, you couldn't have scripted it better, both for the emotions of remembering and then for the actual moment when he hit the home run, or Steve Karsay, and it just, now, unfortunately, I wasn't there. Now, I've had to write a lot of stories in the years that have passed, acting like I was. I've never actually said that I was there, because I was in Kansas City for the Giants' return to play. But obviously I watched that on TV and have talked to Piazza about that, dozens of times through the years for retrospectives and stuff. And have talked to plenty of people who were there, fans, media members. And just, being a lifelong New Yorker and seeing it as it happened, all of a sudden it takes your breath away. And you realize, look, that home run wasn't going to bring anybody back. It wasn't going to solve the terrorist issue. It wasn't going to solve the important problems of our times. But you know what? It was going to make people feel good for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, the rest of the night. And damn it, that's not a bad thing. And that's what sports can do. At its best, that's what sports does. Sometimes we take it to the extreme. We care too much. We don't go to the bathroom for 2 hours because we don't want to leave the couch because the team is doing well. We do stuff like that. Maybe that's taking it to the extreme. But sports is valuable. No one's going to tell me otherwise, because I was there for that entirety of that Yankee run. I saw Mets fans rooting for the Yankees that autumn. I saw the rest of the country outside of Phoenix, maybe Seattle or Oakland, who else they played, rooting for the Yankees in ways that they never would have and never would again. And I saw what it was like in New York. I was there when President Bush threw out the first pitch. And it didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat. You wanted to get up and cheer when he threw a strike. That was our president who did that. And it was just a huge moment. And that's not even taking into account the games that followed and how people just utterly lost themselves in those games. And you know what? You can't tell me that sports isn't impactful beyond just the trivial after having gone through that. And, I think it's really informed a lot of who I am as a columnist now, because, at this point, we're at the point where the majority of my career has existed in a post 9/11 world. And I think it really helped me to thrive during the pandemic. Look, we had, 6 months where we were covering nothing. There was no games. There was nothing. And so you had to really rely on your instincts as to what people wanted to read. I knew they would want to read something. There were some, I had a former editor of mine call me and berate me that I hadn't done what a lot of sports writers had done, which was become full-time COVID-19 writers. And look, a lot of those guys are my friends, and a lot of those guys did just incredible work. You know what? I didn't want to read one more word about COVID-19 after a while. I just didn't. I don't care how good it was, how compelling it was, how incredible the journalism was. I didn't want to read any more about it, so I certainly wouldn't want to write any more about it. I thought I was doing far more of a service to my readers, finding stories to tell them about the day Kareem Abdul-Jabbar decided to sign with UCLA instead of St. John's. Finding a story about Dean Meminger cooling racial tensions in Harlem when he was a teenager because a cop who sought me out to tell me the story about starting an after-school league with Dean Meminger when he was in 12th grade. Stories like that, they're just so vital and so important. And I think that learning about, living through 9/11 as a sports writer allowed you the perspective to realize, it's okay to care about sports, even in times of turmoil, And you know what? I lost my mother a couple of years ago, and it was hilarious because, from the moment my mother died until the moment we were finally able to bury her in Florida, 2 weeks later, the Mets went on a streak where they went like 13-1. My mother was a huge Mets fan. And I remember telling it to Jeff Wilpon. And Jeff and I didn't get along very well for a lot of the time when I was doing my job and he was doing his. But we always talked to each other. And I'll never forget him saying, well, we both know why we're playing well. I thought it was a really nice thing for him to say to a guy who's written a lot of nasty things about him through the years.
No, and to your point, earlier, and it's also again making sure that you don't sulk around for the rest of your life. And I saw a lot of great photos. I'm very and most of the show is NYPD FDNY interviews, and I'm very friendly with the fellows from the NYPD Emergency Service Unit. And working in the stadium through the years, you've probably seen them doing security.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite photos that one of the guys posted from ESU was Ronnie Clover, who worked in Squad 7 in Brooklyn, and his partner Santos Valentine at the old Yankee Stadium
Uh-huh.
after the game's been played. There they are standing on the mound,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
those two guys perished on that day, saving lives. But
Yeah.
it's great. It's not only to continue on is not only a great tribute to just making sure that how would I word it? It's not only a great tribute to common way of life. It's also a tribute to those who have been lost. And
Absolutely, 100%. You know what? I mean, I didn't lose anyone in my close, like probably my two or three closest circle of friends, but I certainly had people that I went to high school with and people that I knew through other people who died that day. And I knew all of those guys well enough to realize that they wouldn't want you just to sit there, to sit in a shell the rest of your lives and not enjoy life. I mean,
right,
that wouldn't be what they wanted. And so you're not necessarily paying tribute to them if you're not enjoying the things that life has to offer. And
hmm
look, I mean, there's an appropriateness to it. I mean, I think it was right that the NFL took a week off. I think it was right that sports as at large took a week off in the wake of 9/11. And clearly, certainly as a health concern, it was the right thing to do during the pandemic. But there's also a point where you need to get back to your lives. And even the people who were the most tragic victims during times like those would want that to happen. I don't think there's any question about that.
A couple more things. I mentioned you going to the Post in '02. You were having a heck of a time at the Star Ledger. And then I'll ask you about your books before we get to the concluding segment. But first, going to the Post in '02, where you've been since. You've covered some great teams recently as well with the Yankees and the Mets, the Rangers run, the '07, '11, and 2011 Giants, the '09 Yankees. What made you want to go there?
Well, I mean, look, and I did. I had a wonderful time at the Star Ledger. Worked with some great people. I still have some dear friends who I worked with and who still work there. Some of them. Like I grew up a New York kid. To me, it was all about the Daily News, the New York Post.
Right.
And I'll tell you a story, and this is the God's honest truth. I mean, It's going to sound like ridiculously too good to be true, but so when I was 7 years old, my father took me to my first baseball game. And I've told the story before, so if any of your listeners have heard the story before, my apologies, but it's kind of the story that defined my life. So if you're going to have me on for this long, it's probably going to be impossible to tell the story of me without telling this story. So my dad took me to my first baseball game at Shea Stadium for Old Timers Day, which is pretty much how I became a Mets fan. If you take me to a Yankees game, my first game, probably would have become a Yankees fan. So I always was unhappy with that during certain times of Yankee prosperity and Mets despair, but that's a whole different story. But we went to Old Timers Day. My father introduced me to everything about the ballpark experience, the green grass and everything. At one point, he pointed to the press box and said, "That's where the sports writers work." And I was 7 years old, and I said, "What do sports writers do?" And he explained, you read the paper sometimes a day, and you read about the Mets games, the Yankees games. They're the ones who write it. And he said, I said, "They do that for a living?" And he said, "Yeah, they do it for a living." 7 years old. So, that honestly, put a seed in my back of my head. There came a point as an athlete I realized, I could probably play varsity sports in high school, but I wasn't going to be pro. As we talked about earlier, I was writing since I was 6 years old, so I'd always had writing. So it became kind of a natural goal for me. But also, the Post specifically was in those days, my father worked in Manhattan to train home. And so what he would do is he would buy the Daily News on his trip into New York in the morning. He would buy the Post, which was an afternoon paper, on his way home. And so he would bring the Post home with him and throw it to me. And that's when I joked to Serby, I would grow up reading him, and it was true. And that's what I did. And after reading the Post, I read the Post every day of my life until I went to college. And because my father would bring home on the train with me. And literally from the time I was 7 years old, I said that I wanted to grow up in sports columnist for the New York Post. Maybe I should have said I wanted to be an astronaut, I wanted to be a senator or something. Maybe that would have come true instead. And I might have been more useful to society that way. But you know what? I mean, it's the God honest truth. I assume there are a finite number of people who get to say that they got to grow up and do exactly what they wanted to do when they were a kid. But I am literally that person. I literally, for 48 years, wanted to be a New York Post, and here I am. So there was that was weighing into the equation. But you know what? It was a hard choice. I mean, but it was made a lot easier when I went to talk to the editor of the Star Ledger, a guy by the name of Jim Wilson, brilliant newspaper man. Spent many years at the Daily News. It actually saved the Daily News during its labor strife in the late 80s, early 90s. Just a terrific guy whose company I enjoyed and still enjoy occasionally corresponding with him on social media. And just a terrific editor. And he knew, it wasn't a secret that I had this offer. And he had me in his office, and he said, "Look, he's like, there's a reason why I don't work in San Francisco anymore." He's like, I came to New York because I wanted to work at the Daily News. I wanted to work at the Post. I wanted to work in New York. And every place else is out of town. And he said, what they're going to offer you is more money than we can pay you, and they're going to offer you the back page of the Post. And if you say yes, I'm going to have a hard time telling you why you shouldn't say yes. And that may sound like a weird way to like try and make a counter offer, although it ultimately did. But you know what? He got me, and that's exactly what it was. I mean, the Post was offering me, it was a raise, but I mean, and sure, everybody wants to do better financially. But they were offering me the back page of the Post, and that really spoke to me in a way that currency or anything else couldn't. Probably in my time, the Post had 75 to 100 back pages. I've collected every one of them. A lot of them hang in the wall in my home office.
As they should.
As they should. I mean, they are. And look, one of the great things is, I know that even our newspaper has embraced the digital side. People don't necessarily pick up the paper as they did, but the back page and the front page of the paper still matters. They still pick up the front page of the Post on Good Morning America. They still pick up the back page of the Post on Sunday Night Football if it warrants it. And, I love being a part of that. I've been a part of that for 20 years, which is hard for me to fathom. But it's been just a blast. I mean, just a blast. And the hilarious part is, the one thing that people in Newark told me was, you never know about the Post. I mean, it's here today, gone tomorrow. And, knock wood, is still here all these years later. I've been very lucky, very fortunate. And it's been a joyride. It really has been. I mean, I enjoy literally every second I've worked at the Post. It's been incredible.
Magic carpet ride, some might say.
Really
and to borrow the line from the old Steppenwolf song,
how do you know Steppenwolf? You're 22 years old.
I'm an old soul. You
and me both. That's why I have so many Sinatra records. Sinatra
love Steppenwolf. So that said, like I said when I was introducing you, you've written 3 books, and even though it doesn't get easier because writing a book is naturally not easy, once you do it the first time, you have a general idea and it allows you to move forward. But that first book you wrote, tell me about what prompted you to want to write it and just how difficult that process was.
Well, that book specifically, which was going to be a history of the Red Sox-Yankees rivalry, which probably sounds like, oh my God, what else can be said? But you know what? That was the start of this secondary phase of that rivalry. So it was still, I won't say it was virgin territory, but there was still a lot of ground to cover. And honestly, I was there at Yankee Stadium when Aaron Boone's home run went over the fence. I was in the Red Sox clubhouse that night. I was in the Yankees clubhouse that night. I was in Boston, in New York, during that playoff series. And I was like, there's a story to tell here in a way that's different than the way it's been told before. And so, and I was lucky enough to get an agent who loved the idea, shopped it around, was able to sell it to Doubleday, which I had a great partnership with Doubleday. And they were excited about the book. And, the story about that book, it was a joy. I wanted to write it from all the different angles, from the players, the participants. I wanted to have 6 very firm fan voices from both sides of it to explain how important it was. I wanted to delve into the history. I mean, it was a fun project. And look, as I explained in the introduction to the book, I mean, I grew up a fan of neither team, but an admirer of both. So I knew certainly a lot about Yankee history and Red Sox history. Also in the introduction, I read about just an accidental experience I had in spring training that year, where I was going through a poker phase. And it's funny, whenever I would show up at a poker room wearing a Yankees hat, and I'm just a guy who wears a lot of hats. I collect hats. And one day I walked in the poker room with a hat, and it was like people looked at you different. Like, this guy knows what he's doing. And I walked in, and I walked in another day with a Red Sox cap, and it was like people just thought that I was, they say in Rounders, you're the sucker. The guy in the Red Sox cap, that's the guy. I'm not doing anything they said, but just through the way, it's hard to even put a finger on. And so basically the theme of the book was about how the hammer versus nail rivalry has gone on forever and it's going to keep going on. And it was written through 2003, and it was all written before the playoffs, and all that they needed was a one final chapter that was going to talk about the entirety of the 2004 season, which of course was proceeding exactly as it was supposed to. The Yankees won the division. They beat the Red Sox when they had to beat them. And of course, then they go up 3-0, 19-8 in Game 3. And I'm just like, yeah, baby, I am ready to push send. And they're ready to. This book is going to build my summer house. I'm going to do all kinds of wonderful things with this book. Well, George King was a guy who covered the Yankees for many years. He was my dear friend and partner at the Post. And he sat next to me. And he was a guy of very few words, very gruff when he wanted to be. And I showed up for Game 4, and he's like, "Yeah, so you're all set, huh?" I'm like, "Well, we're going to get one more win." And he's like, you realize no team's ever come back from 3-0. I know. Well, of course, the Yankees lost that night because Big Papi hit a home run. And as we're getting ready to attack our stories, George turns to me and he's like, "Don't worry about it. You're still fine. It's all good." Next day, again, the Yankees are 5 outs away from winning, from making putting them on easy street. And again, the Red Sox come back, and again they win because Papi hits a RBI single in the 14th inning, whatever it was. And King turns to me and says, "You're still fine. It's all good." And Game 6 happens the next day, and of course, all kinds of crazy things happen. You get the A-Rod slap play, and all that kind of crazy stuff happens. And the game ends, and King turns to me and says, "Might be in a little bit of trouble." And I swear to God, this happened, and I'll clean this up for the purposes of a family podcast. But we're watching Kevin Brown warm up before Game 7. He and I are sitting next to each other in the press box. And he turns to me and goes, "You're effed." And I sure
the players
was.
knew it. The players, even Messina was saying before the game, he's like, "Yeah, we're done."
And it's hilarious, Mike, because before Game 7, I was on the phone with my editor at Doubleday, and I was frantic. I'm like, "Well, what am I going to do here? I mean, this book can't run as it is if the Yankees lose this to the Red Sox, especially in historic fashion." And he said, "Well, I don't have any problem running with it. I mean, people know what happened. You can just cover it in the epilogue." I said, "Jason, I think I got to go back and redo the whole book." And he's like, "Well, there's time, not a lot of time. We need this ready to go by November 15th." And it was I think the day was October 17th or October 18th. I'm like, "Okay, fine. Hopefully we won't worry about it." But of course, you know what happened. So the whole story gets turned upside down. And I mean, I rewrote 100,000 words in 3.5 weeks. And it was the most satisfying work I've ever done because, I mean, that's a lot of words to churn. It wound up a better book. It was a better book. I mean, believe me, I read the book as was. I read the book as it became. It was a better book. Didn't have a better title, I don't think. The original title was going to be "Damn Yankees, Damn Sox." I like that title. I still like that title. But I had to get rid of the title first because it didn't apply anymore. And so I changed it to "Emperors and Idiots." And it was a much better book. And my editor was like, he agreed. He's like, this book, he said the one you turned in September was fantastic. That this book is 50% better. It just is. It's a better book. It flows better. It's got a better story. And of course it ends different. But we both knew, we didn't say, is that the problem is, we both had visions of massive book sales in our head because it was a perfect story. Zillions of Yankees fans are going to want to read stories not only about the Yankees, but about how they own the Red Sox, right? Well, suddenly the book is not about that. And suddenly all of our New York customers, who may be big fans of my writing in the Post, but they don't want to read a book rehashing the worst moment in their history as a fan.
Right.
And of course, Red Sox fans who are triumphant don't want to read a New Yorker's interpretation of this. And they have plenty of their own. I mean, Dan Shaughnessy wrote a book, and Lee Montville wrote a book. They got plenty of interpretations in their own voice, if you will. The book sold pretty well, but put it this way, I wasn't able to retire on it. And it was still a great experience. And those books are all wonderful experiences. I told you the birth of the 41 book, which was great. And even the book that I wrote, the most recent book I wrote, which is about the 1912 World Series, and just an amazing cast of characters that played in it and were around it. My day job, I write 700 words, I'm in and out, do it today, then do it again tomorrow. When you write a book, you can kind of luxuriate for a couple of hours, write 2,000, 3,000 words. And especially when you're writing about a certain time frame. And when I was writing that 1912 book, I can honestly find myself descending into this black and white place where I was wearing a fedora and writing on a typewriter almost. It was that kind of a thing. It was really enjoyable. And, I'm not one of these writers who's going to tell you that I'm tortured by the writing process. I actually like the writing process. I like putting my hands on the keyboard and typing out the words and editing myself. I like it when I'm 400 words into a column and I say to myself, this stinks. And I go back to the beginning and start over again. I don't like it so much when I'm on deadline. That's a whole story, different story. But I actually like the writing process. And so I like writing. I loved writing those 3 books. And I really enjoy it every day when I have a chance to write a column and I know I got 700 words to type and I can't wait to do it. I mean, maybe that's part of why I've been successful, but it's certainly why I'm still enthusiastic about this job after doing it close to 35 years, 20 in New York. And it's a blast. It really is.
When you love what you do, you never work a day in your life.
Exactly. My father told me that, and I credit him because during some early struggles early in my career, he said, you know what, you can also do what I did, and, take the train to a job you hate for 25 years. I suggest holding on and see if this is a job that you can actually make a career out of. And man, he's given me a lot of good advice through the years, but he never gave me anything that was smarter than that to chew on.
And on that note, we can go right into the last segment of the show, which is the rapid fire. It's 5 hit-and-run questions from me, 5 hit-and-run answers from you. Are you ready?
Yes, let's do it.
And you can say pass if you want first. And we've kind of talked about it throughout the podcast, but in terms of a humor standpoint, in terms of a content standpoint, favorite athlete through any sport that you've ever covered?
David Colón. I had a lot of great conversations with him when he was a player. He's a guy who wanted to be a sports writer. Very smart guy. I mean, the guy you hear on ESPN and on the S Network, that was the guy you found in his locker. And he was a guy who was willing to talk to you, 10 minutes before a game if you had to. So probably my favorite subject.
I love listening to him on Yankee games and ESPN as well. He's very good at what he does. Second, favorite athlete you wish you could have covered of any era?
Mickey Mantle, because he was a complicated guy. Now, I say that thinking that I might have been able to cover him the way that we cover athletes today. It's not necessarily how they were covered in the 50s and 60s. But I got a chance to interview him in a group setting once, very much toward the end, and felt cheated because I thought that was a guy that I would have found fascinating to write about day in and day out.
Out of all the sports you've covered, greatest game, this is the third question, of course, greatest game you've ever seen live where you were there?
All right, I'm glad you asked the question because no one ever believes me. But by day 13 of the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, my boss said, I'm tired of swimming stories. I'm tired of track and field. Find me something different. And so I walked around the Olympic Village, not the Olympic Village where the athletes live, but where they play. And I walked into a pavilion and was met by a deafening roar as I opened the door. And I walked in, and there's probably 8,000 people filling 8,000 seats, 4,000 on each side. And it's a badminton match between Malaysia and South Korea. And it just so happened that I befriended, believe it or not, somebody from a Malaysian English-speaking paper a couple of days earlier. And I found him, and I asked him for a background. It turns out that these teams have played each other for years. Malaysia had never been able to beat South Korea, but they had a team they thought could do it. And so I sat down and I watched 3 hours of the most intense badminton game you've ever seen. And Malaysia had like match point a couple of times, but couldn't finish it off. Korea comes back the entire time. Every point, one side or the other was yelling at each other. The fans were into it. It was the most amazing thing I ever saw. And then I went back and I wrote the column. I sent it to my office, and the editor said, "You wrote about badminton?" I said, "You wanted something different. This is as different as it gets." And that column actually wound up winning an award. But, single best game. So yes, that was the best game I ever covered.
Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City or New Jersey?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. But Foley's was my favorite. I was a guy who was too young for Toots Shor, which was maybe the first famous establishment that was populated by a lot of sports figures. A little too young for Runyon's, which was really a very popular watering hole in the 80s and 90s. I got there right at the tail end. Foley's was right there for me. I knew the proprietor so well, and I would never went there and had a bad time. And sadly, the pandemic, they were thinking about closing it anyway shortly, but the pandemic finally took out its legs. That was my favorite place because you could always find somebody to talk sports with you there.
And fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would Mike Vaccaro now tell a younger Mike Vaccaro?
Retain your ambition, but have patience, because you're not going to get everything you want immediately. Sometimes you're going to have to work for it. Sometimes you're going to have to work a lot longer for it. But as long as you know what you want, as long as you have confidence in yourself, and the other thing that being patient allows you to do is living your life. I missed a lot of things in my 20s and my 30s, trying to get where I got. Part of that was because I was working, and I don't feel bad about that. Part of it was because I was obsessed with working. And so even when I wasn't necessarily working, I was just unavailable for family matters and for personal matters with friends in a way that I should have been, and I regret that. And I think if I was more patient and had more belief that my ambition, my hard work would pay off, I would have allowed myself to enjoy those moments a little better at a time when it would have been really important to me.
Before we go and stick around, we'll say goodbye off the air. If people don't know where to find you, where can they find you? Besides the post, of course.
Sure. On Twitter, I'm at Mike Vacc. That's at Mike Vacc with 2 C's. And and my nypost.com. I think it's Mike Vaccaro after that, but just go to sports, you'll find me. You'll see my ugly mug. I'm hard to miss. And the 3 books, they're all available for download. Someplace you can get them on Amazon still. One is called Emperors and Idiots, about the Red Sox-Yankees rivalry. One is 1941, the greatest team in sports. And one is the First Fall Classic, which is about the 1912 World Series. And I'm really proud of all 3 of those. I'm happy whenever people get a chance to discover them, because the work holds up, I think.
Love it. Like I said, stick around. Thanks for doing this, and thanks to everybody that tuned in. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, like I said, we're not relegated to one category or the other. This will be the second show of a doubleheader. If there was a fugitive to be found in New York and New Jersey, he was on the case along with this task force. And why? Because he ran the task force. I'm talking about Lenny DePaul. It's the first time I've ever interviewed a U.S. Marshal. And he, in addition to being with the U.S. Marshals, he was with the Secret Service and also a member of the amphibious assault team with the U.S. Navy. So that should be an interesting show with him tonight. That's 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So in about 5 hours or so, you'll see me with him. Hope to see you guys again for that show. So thanks, guys, for tuning in. And on behalf of Mike Vaccaro, I'll see you later tonight. We will see you next time.